Hello, everybody. I'm Alex Pusansky, president and founder of Impact Justice. We're a national innovation and research center based here in Oakland, California, with offices across the country in Southern California and Washington, D.C. I'm thrilled that you are taking the time to join us today for our Impact Ideas event entitled Meeting the Moment, Philanthropy in the Age of Uncertainty. This event is part of a series called Impact Ideas. We created Impact Ideas a few years ago as a virtual space for compelling conversations that help translate big ideas into impact. During each conversation, we explore the work that's needed to build the future we all want to experience in this country and how to create an impact that reaches people's everyday lives. Today's conversation is a perfect topic for Impact Ideas, given the moment we're in, and we're hopeful it'll be a helpful jumping off point for organizations like ours and many of those of people who are here watching today who are grappling with the uncertainty of today's funding environment. During today's event, you'll hear from leading philanthropic thinker and writer David Callahan, the founder and editor of Inside Philanthropy, who will be in conversation with our very own Vice President of Innovation Programs, Aishatu, Yusuf. I will now turn it over to Aishatu to get us started. Thank you for coming today.
Thank you so much, Alex. Hi, everybody. As Alex said, my name is Aishatu. I'm the Vice President of Innovation Programs here at Impact Justice, which is so exciting for me to be both part of this conversation, but also to be at Impact Justice during this time doing such great work. So I'm excited to have this conversation. I want to first introduce who we're actually interviewing today. David Callahan. I'm so excited to be here with you. Just to give you a quick bio on David, I want to be clear, his bio is huge, so I'm going to shrink it down a little bit to this, but please check it out because David has done so many amazing things. So David Callahan is the founder and editor of Inside Philanthropy. He's written extensively on trends in philanthropy, as well as American culture, public policy, and business. David is an author, most recently of The Givers, Wealth, Power, and Philanthropy in a New Gilded Age. He's a widely quoted expert in philanthropy. He's also an editor of the Inside Philanthropy Reader, essential articles on giving, from crowdfunding to the rise of billionaire donors. He's an editor of the State of America Philanthropy and written numerous white papers that's been published in the Inside Philanthropy. Before launching Inside Philanthropy in 2014, David co-founded Demos, which is the national think tank where he held various leadership positions and conducted research on a wide range of issues, including the economy, political inequality, and has written on moral values, professional ethics, and business. In addition to The Givers, which is his new book, David is the author of 7 widely reviewed books on domestic and international issues. He has appeared on hundreds of TV shows and radio shows and has published in many op-eds in New York Times and Washington Post, to name a few. So, David, thank you so much for being here. We're excited to have you.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
I'm going to jump on in, if that's okay with you, David, and I'm going to start with the federal government. So until recently, the federal funding for nonprofits was considered some of the most stable sources of funding. People were building organizations and programs in the hopes of getting federal funding, which creates stability of their organization. However, as you and many in the audience know, in recent months, organizations, including Impact Justice, abruptly lost a significant portion of that funding. So at the same time, state budgets are being strained and all the fiscal pressure or what is being categorized as not enough money to go around. So my question for you is, what do you see as the long-term trajectory of government funding? And how should nonprofits and funders reorient while staying true to their mission and values and what it is they do?
Yeah, it's a pretty scary time for any organization that gets federal funding. And obviously, it's going to get a lot worse thanks to the bill that the Republicans just passed, which will see big cuts in healthcare and a lot of holes ripped in the social safety net for food security as well in other areas. One point that I made in my book, The Givers, which came out in 2017, is that even putting aside having this kind of administration come in and start blowing things up the way it has, the long-term trajectory for federal funding was pretty grim. The amount of money for non-defense discretionary spending, which is basically everything outside of entitlements like Social Security and Medicare, non-defense discretionary spending includes that bucket of money for national parks, the environment, education, biomedical research. That portion of the budget has just been going down pretty steadily over the past few decades, and the prognosis for it has been pretty more of the same in terms of a downward trend as these big entitlement obligations kick in coming years. I mean, the challenges facing Medicare and Social Security fiscally are really severe, and it's going to squeeze a lot of domestic spending. And the situation in states and localities is pretty bad too. There's tremendous unfunded pension liabilities in both those arenas, which are going to squeeze out a lot of spending on other things.
I couldn't agree more with all of what you said. Maybe you've written a little bit about this, but I'm also wondering, what are some of the things we should do to reorient our ways to that changing environment? Like, what are the things differently, both on the funder side, but also particularly for the nonprofits, who I think that's a big piece of the audience, should be doing differently, or the same, if you say that as well, to respond to that, to respond to what's happening, that we can all kind of see what's happening.
Right. I mean, for a lot of organizations, there's not going to be very good options in terms of replacing public funding. I think the good news, and there's a bad news element too, there's going to be a lot of new money coming into philanthropy. If you look at the wealth concentrated at the top and just these vast fortunes, many of which have been pledged to philanthropy through this giving pledge. A lot of people, including myself, have cast doubt on the giving pledge. This is the pledge from Bill Gates and Warren Buffett, which includes all these billionaires saying they're going to give away at least half of their money. A lot of them haven't really given much, but eventually that money is going to start to flow. I mean, just take the Google guys alone. The two co-founders of Google are worth $100 billion or more a piece. And these people are going to turn to philanthropy. And so there's going to be new opportunities with these billionaire donors for lots of different nonprofits. We've seen with McKinsey Scott, the way that you have like a single big mega donor who parachutes into lots of different areas with very big checks. It can be transformative, but it's still not going to make up for that lost government funding.
Yeah, I agree. I couldn't agree more. Some of the conversations that I've been having with funders in some ways has been a bit of a standstill, because the conversation is that we know philanthropy can't fill those holes. So what is there to do? And I think both on the funder side, it feels like they're not certain what to do in some ways. And then I think on the nonprofit side, they often feel like, how do we push these funders to move, and how do we push them to respond in some way that's going to get us to where we need to go, whether that's a reduction in programming, what that might be. But I feel like there's a little standstill that's happening on both sides, and I'm hoping we can get past the next couple of months and weeks. Into that.
I would just add, there's a big question about whether we can get more small donors involved in supporting nonprofit organizations. A lot of groups really have a very small donor base. I mean, there's certain nonprofits like the ACLU, which have tons of small donors, but your typical organization working on some issue does not. And what we've seen in politics is that small donors have revolutionized fundraising in that area. And it used to be, if you were going to run for political office, you were heavily dependent upon PACs. But Bernie Sanders, he raised $500 million for his 2 runs for president. And what I would like to see is some revolution in the nonprofit space, of many more small donors coming to support organizations that reflect their values, that having more small donors step forward as government steps back.
I love that you mentioned that. If our director of development is listening, she knows I care so much about this topic around small donors or even individual donors, because it is a different strategy than big foundations. And I think nonprofits do have to both have the capacity and understanding of how you make that shift, because it is quite a shift. But I agree with you. You correct me if I'm wrong, but I remember, I think the Obama campaign was One of his elections was actually was partially funded by individual donors giving $10, $20, $30, $50. And I think we oftentimes don't think about that. One of the other things that happens too, in my world around philanthropy, is that so often some of the small donors, whatever small means in this conversation, donors sometimes say things to us like, I'm not the Gates Foundation, or I'm not Bloomberg, what that is. And it kind of doesn't allow them to think about what their actual impact could be. So I would love if there was also a conversation that helped move those small donors to know how much impact they can actually make, not being some of the big, philanthropies that we know.
Yeah, it can feel like, what's the difference of my $100 or $500 when you got these big billionaire donors who can contribute so much money? But we've seen in politics that people have believed that, hey, as small donors have power, that we can disrupt this old system whereby, a handful of big donors really made or broke candidates, especially during primaries. And that's really changed a lot. And so we need a similar revolution in philanthropy.
Yeah. Yes. One of the interesting things that I'm gathering from this conversation is, and you run a nonprofit and you also clearly are extremely deeply rooted in philanthropy. So I think you might be the perfect person to ask this question, which is, beyond the mega billionaires, what is a donor? Do we need to change the definition or expand the definition of what it means to be a donor outside of the mega billionaires or even the millionaires? Are there stereotypes of what a donor is that don't hold up in 2025 that we need to think about that expanded definition?
Yeah, I think of a donor as somebody who just takes extra money that they have to advance their values, right? And you can do that at any level. And it's empowering. I contributed a lot of money for the 2024 election cycle and also raised a lot of money. And what I found is that people felt empowered. It's so much better to do something than nothing. Yeah. And I think that organizations can also do a better job for sure, of communicating what small donors mean to them and how their, even modest donations can really make a big difference.
Yeah, particularly in some of the work that we do at Impact Justice, we have, projects that have been around for 6 years. We have projects that we're just starting and we're trying to raise small amounts of dollars for. And some of the things we're often thinking about is for some of the smaller donors that say we can only give $20,000 to X or $15,000 or $50,000 to X. We're often thinking about is how can we apply those dollars to something that's a small piece of something that we can't get done. Right? Whether that's a newsletter or something like that does make a big difference, that those small dollars can actually change the way we engage with our community or the work that we do. And I think oftentimes it's kind of hard to translate what a $25,000, what a $10,000 gift can do for your organization. And I think that partially is because clearly we all are thinking about how do we get the McKinsey Scott money? How do we get the Gates dollars? So that,
Which is problematic. We have a very top-heavy philanthropic ecosystem where big donors have more and more power. Just a reality check on our conversation here, which is that, participation by small donors in charitable giving has been going down in the last 20 years. Even as it's going up in the political space, it's been going down in the charitable space, which means that, the rich have more and more power in terms of their donations and wielding influence over civil society. And, that's not great. It's not great to be a nonprofit where you're heavily dependent upon a handful of big foundations and wealthy individuals.
Yeah. And particularly, again, thinking about the fact that people are often trying to use the private dollars, which are usually a little more flexible, have a little more risk, to create a program that they can one day get to federal dollars. And because at least for the next few years and maybe longer, those dollars may not be available, we have to be able to both push philanthropy, large, small, medium donors, and nonprofits to think differently, I think, about what it means to give and what it is they give to. What are your thoughts? I think given the political landscape that we're experiencing right now. I've seen a lot of donors say, you know, I need to give my dollars that I was giving to nonprofits, fill in the blank strategy. I'm now shifting those dollars to civic engagement, or I'm shifting those dollars to democracy, which I think you and I both agree are amazing. But what would be the conversation that you think nonprofits need to use around this idea of, you know, is there enough to go around? Can we do both, or how we think about one without the other? Because, you know, the truth is we put all our money in democracy, the things that you're often fighting for, you will no longer have structures on the back end, and opposite. Have you thought about this, or have thoughts around that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really tough situation because on the one hand, funding something like the arts can seem like a lower priority at a moment when we face this existential threat of authoritarian, political movement in this country. And on the other hand, you can't just pull the plug on longstanding grantees who are doing really important work across, whether it's the arts or human services or environmental work or criminal justice work. And so I think the only real solution here is more money needs to come to the table. And that there is plenty of it out there, right? It's that these foundations have resources that they can bring to bear if they so choose. Many abide by these 5% payout limits, which they just need to take a more flexible view. Some have, many have not. And this is something that we write about and campaign on all the time in Inside Philanthropy, is that in moments like this, foundations need to increase their payout. But even more, what's even more realistic is that wealthy individuals who really do have a lot of flexibility, they don't have boards of trustees. They don't have to get their chief financial officer on board to, increase their giving. Those are the people who can really step forward in a much bigger way. And we've seen this with Bill Gates. I mean, that was a positive thing that's happened recently, which is that Gates announced he would accelerate the spend down of his foundation and put a lot more money into the system sooner rather than later.
Yeah, that's a great segue into my next question. Before I go to the next question, I want to say two things, which is, one, I love that you mentioned that certain foundations or family foundations that don't have quite the bureaucracy that exists have the opportunity to give dollars in a way that doesn't require so many steps. And I have seen it happen. So at Impact Justice, we lost federal funding for our AmeriCorps project, which funds young people's jobs. And it just so happened that I was at an event that had a lot of donors, small, large, medium. And I used the opportunity to say, who can put in something? Right? Urgently. Jobs in the summertime for formerly incarcerated young people, so important. And we did actually have some donors that said, I don't have a lot, but I have $100,000. Can that make a difference? And those moments and first of all, yes, it made a huge difference. But I also think that oftentimes we're, as nonprofits, we're not translating the quick urgency in a way for those kind of smaller foundations to know that their money can make a difference for our programs. And I think there's a little bit of a gap in figuring out how we translate that information quickly so that they know what those dollars can do outside of the millions of dollars. And I think that's probably a PR comms issue, but I think it's one of the things as nonprofits we have to be thinking about.
Well, and also making the argument that these donors need to front load their giving, that if they don't step forward at this moment in a bigger way, the things they care about may not be salvageable later.
Yeah.
And I think that this is really important in regard to, the broader issue of democracy, which is if we're facing an existential threat here from an authoritarian political movement, and you're saving your money for a rainy day, well, the opportunities to make progress on any issues you care about may close, right? And everything that philanthropy and the nonprofit sector does exists downstream from politics and who has power. And if, liberals are in the minority politically in the next 5 or 6 election cycles, the entire agenda of left of center, the left of center nonprofit world is going to basically grind to a halt. And,
Right.
We'll be lucky if we're just holding on to the things that we have built over the last 50 or 80 years, right? I mean, it's endless defensive rearguard battles. So I think that for all donors need to be thinking about the fact that it is raining now. There's no point in saving your money for a rainy day. I mean, it's pouring, right? It's like, what's the point of having all this money sitting in reserve for future giving if we had this catastrophe unfolding right now?
Yeah, absolutely. Before I go on to the next question, I want to remind everyone that I know David and I are vibing right now, but I promise you we're going to save some questions for the end. So please make sure that you stay to the end and have opportunity to ask your questions around that time. One of the things that I think that you talked about that I find really important is around this idea of like, it's a hailstorm. This current moment is a hailstorm, right? And you argue in some of your writing that regardless of program area, the urgency in the moment is happening now and funders need to respond accordingly to that. I think I would also add to that is while, yes, this type of urgency is unprecedented, as nonprofit leaders, every year brings a new version of urgency and fear. So whether that is a retrenchment on a particular strategy, whether that's to fit like a, reduced state funding, whether that's big culture swings, the truth is that, yes, this is a catastrophic moment, but every single year we have one. And I think I actually hope I'm wrong on this, but I don't think that's stopping anytime soon. And you kind of alluded to that, right? Now is the moment. Now is the hailstorm. Now is when it's raining. So if that is true, and we don't see a pathway right now to where some of these catastrophic moments or the urgency is going to change, how do we move funders to think about making bolder moves, right? You mentioned Gates Foundation, right? MacArthur's also increased payout. There's been some other bold moves that have happened. How do we push funders to say, now is the urgent moment and we're going to have one again next year? And you said the next 4 or 5 cycles, and that's terrifying. But also, like, what do we do now? And how do we push philanthropy to say, now is the urgency, here's what you should do. And maybe what is that to do? Maybe you have ideas of what is the to do they should be doing?
Well, in terms of how to get people to give more, one recurring concern that donors have is, will more money make a difference? Like, what is the point of stepping forward in a bigger way? And related to that, can it be spent effectively? Is there a plan? And I think that there's a lot of tendency among people in nonprofit organizations to think pretty small, that they're not presenting their donors with really big, ambitious plans for deploying a lot more money rapidly, because those of us who've run or helped run nonprofit organizations get so used to growing incrementally and, a sort of tight-fistedness on the part of the funding world. And it's, hard to imagine anybody ever coming along and giving you like $10 million or some huge gift. But I think that when nonprofits are willing to put forth a bigger vision of like, here is what we could do with a whole bunch of money, and here is why it would make a difference in this moment. In a recent article I wrote in Inside Philanthropy, I was addressing specifically funders having uncertainty about how to push back against this kind of MAGA juggernaut, and where could more investments actually make a difference in terms of slowing down the Trump policy agenda and setting the stage for turning things around politically. And I think that there's a lot of discouragement among funders on those larger issues of how to shift power. And what I argue in my piece is, actually, we have effectively pushed back against these policies in the past. The first Trump administration saw big investments in civil society organizations that educated the public about the effects of Trump policies, shifted the public into more of an oppositional mode, blocked the repeal of the Affordable Care Act. That was one of Trump's top priorities. Blocked many of his executive branch actions through litigation, and set the stage for the Democrats to take back the House in 2018, which effectively brought the Trump legislative agenda to an end, and then regain the White House in 2020. And a lot of that pushback was made possible with philanthropic dollars deployed legally to a variety of organizing groups across the country. And that whole infrastructure, which really was supersized during the Trump 1.0 period, is now larger and more sophisticated than ever. And all those organizations are out there and can absorb a lot of money. So my message to funders is that, you need to deploy money to shift public opinion and block what you can and lay the groundwork for electoral change, because ultimately that's what's going to bring this to an end.
Yeah. I love that you brought up this idea of how do we think big around so much of this. Alex Uzansky, who introduced this conversation, often says, we need you to do something, right? And I think sometimes when the conversation is around, I can't fill the gap, I can't fill the hole, I can't restart your program. I think some of the conversation is do something, and here is what you could do. I think the truth is it's not the funder's responsibility to devise the plan of what to do. There's so many nonprofits that do this work and have such a deep expertise. In many ways, it's our job to say, here's the big picture. Here's what you can do to help support that. I think in some ways, the human reaction to loss of money, which was devastating for Impact Justice and for other organizations, you have to kind of dig yourself out of that hole a bit to get to the idea of what is the big picture, what can be done. But I think we need to get there a little faster or move there now, right? Because I think what we don't want to do is to have funders creating agendas that are not in alignment with what the field knows needs to happen, or holding to their money until they see that big event they want to do. But I think we have to kind of push what is the big idea? How do we think big about what is possible while still holding the loss that we all had? But how do we think big to what is possible to really galvanize the funders to say, here's what you can plug in, and this is what can happen if you do that.
And I think that in that process, it's really important to acknowledge where things have gone wrong.
Yeah.
I think that if there's strategies that haven't worked, and I think for the progressive movement writ large, there certainly are, then there needs to be an honest conversation and reappraisal about that. We need to take an unflinching look at what has worked and what's not worked, because otherwise you're not going to have trust with the donors. I mean, if the solution is, we're just going to double down on the same things we were doing before, and with no acknowledgement of any problems, that's not going to pass the credibility test for a lot of people.
Yeah, I like that you call it the credibility test. I think, both on the funder side and the nonprofit side, that exists in some ways. And I think, over the last 10 years, we've had these humongous culture shifts that I think clearly have weakened what we understood as a credibility test in some ways. And I think we kind of have to fight through that a little bit. You talk about that in some of your writing around culture wars and how we get back to the heart of what the issue is. And I think it kind of gets to that. I'm actually going to stay in the line of this thinking, which is you've written, that progressive movements have recently pushed the envelope too far. And that ultimately it's eroded coalitions and led to political losses, which you were talking about earlier. Can you help us or help me understand how you think about the role of progressive organizations in our cultural climate? And what do you mean by, or how are you categorizing too far? And why is it important to kind of have a conversation of what that means in this moment?
Well, I think the elephant in the room is declining working class support for the left of center coalition in the Democratic Party. Non-college voters of all races have been abandoning the Democratic Party. And this has recently accelerated with more voters of color exiting the left of center coalition, and particularly Latino voters, who we saw Trump actually won Latino men in the last election, and also made big gains in Asian American communities, and that he also made gains in 2020 as well. So there's two election cycles where Trump, despite being the most xenophobic and racist politician of our lifetime, has actually increased his voter share with voters of color. And the explanation I give in my article for that is that that these voters are primarily concerned about the economy and the affordability crisis that they face, along with a lot of other Americans, including many college-age Americans who are college-educated Americans who are living more precarious lives. That these economic concerns are front and center in voters' minds, and particularly working class voters' minds, but they have not been front and center for either the progressive movement or the Democratic Party. If you ask voters, as a poll recently did in January, what issues do they think are most important to the Democratic Party? What voters said was reproductive rights, LGBTQ rights, and climate change. And voters themselves said that the economy was the most important issue. Now, to be clear, progressive positions are on cultural issues are popular in many cases. Certainly that's true of reproductive rights and access to abortion. But these are not the top concerns for voters. And so there's sort of been a mismatch between what our coalition has been primarily focused on and what voters are focused on. And that, I think, has created a real opening for the Republicans and Trump to make inroads with a lot of working class voters of color who, as I said, are primarily concerned about getting ahead economically as their number one issue.
Yeah, I think that's a great synopsis of it. I will also hold that I think that so many of things that happen in our American society are so nuanced and have so many layers to them that I think oftentimes, however, removing the definition of what's happening and why is sometimes hard to hold in just like one hand, right? Because in one hand, it is absolutely true. The economy is the issue for many people, right? Oftentimes people are still searching that American dream. On the other side, right, we do have these really important cultural things that are happening. And the lack of response around cultural issues, alienates some of a population of progressives or liberals. So not talking about that has an impact, and then not thinking about the economy, I think, as a holistic thing is also having an impact. It feels like there's like an impasse. It feels like there's little strategy to think about how you meld the two or how you operate within the two. And I think that, in my opinion, some of that is also hurting where we go in this kind of political movement and this kind of conversation, because both are important. I think probably the economy holds a deeper importance, as that's how people live and thrive. And I think every couple of weeks, every couple of months, there's a huge cultural shift that happens that we have to pay attention to. And I don't know if you have thoughts on how you think about both of those things existing at the same time. Would curious to know if you have thoughts about how they do that.
Well, it's a challenge for a political coalition. I mean, there's big pieces of the left of center coalition for whom the most important issues are, access to abortion or their ability to be themselves as a trans person, or climate change and or gun safety. And these are, you can't just throw key constituencies under the bus and say we're going to focus on the economy because that's all that matters. I think that what I advocate is just greater balance. I think we've had a kind of imbalanced flow of funding and imbalanced sort of set of voices that have been amplified, that we need to sort of turn up the volume on the economic side of things considerably. And there's a lot of great work being done by a new labor movement that is bringing people together to fight for, higher wages, affordable housing, paid family leave. There's all sorts of great work that philanthropy could be investing in more at scale. The other just thing to keep in mind here, a backdrop for all of our discussions about nonprofits and politics and philanthropy, is that media and narrative are incredibly important. And the right has a massive advantage here. It has built a very large ecosystem of influencers, of media sites, and it has a huge audience and can really shift political debates, often with outright lies and misinformation, and that this is something that funders on the left to center side really need to pay attention to. This has not been a priority issue. I think most funders don't pay attention to culture or media, and that this needs to sort of go from the back burner to the front burner very fast. Otherwise, obviously, if you can't shape the narrative of what people are talking about in this country, then it doesn't matter what issues you're working on, because you're just going to be drowned out by these sort of larger noise.
Yeah, I think I don't know if you agree with this, but I assume based on your writings that you do, which is the conservative movement has been for a long time kind of building this constituency around media, around influencers, that is, I think, just kind of continued to rise in importance. And I think we saw that clearly play out in the last presidential election. And I think some of the progressive did it in some ways, but I think in many ways it still was leaning towards culture identity in some ways and less around economy, to use that as an example. Do you think it's too late? Do you think that the hill's too hard to climb for them to start to dive into maybe a similar context or a similar way they think about building up media and communications relationships and influencing in social media? Is it too late? What are your thoughts on that?
No, I don't think it's too late. It's these things are going to be unfolding for a long time. I mean, there's a lot of great and interesting stuff and experimentation that is now going on in terms of building new sorts of media properties and new cultural influencing channels. A key way to understand it is that most Americans are not interested in politics, and they're not interested in issues. And media or information that speaks to politics or issues exclusively is just, most people are not going to pay attention to that. Mm-hmm. What we need to do to reach people is we need to build up cultural and lifestyle kinds of media properties, and then push political and issue messages through those channels, which is a lot of what the right has done. I mean, the Joe Rogan show is not primarily about politics, right? He has some political guests. He has a large audience, as many of those influencers on the right do. They have a large audience because they talk about a lot of different things. And then having built that audience, they have a place to then promote their political values, right? And I think that there's some great work that's happening left to center that is trying to do something similar. An organization like Accelerate Change, which has a lot of different media properties, which are primarily lifestyle properties. And I think that philanthropy has the real potential to get behind that work in a big way. And if it doesn't, it's going to have a hard time getting traction for a lot of its values in years going forward.
Yeah. Impact Justice, we talk clearly to a lot of funders. And one of the things we often say is there's three big distinct roles that we see funders playing: small, large, medium, which is to fund, that's dollars, which is to connect nonprofits to other people who possibly could give dollars, but also possibly partner, and then to convene, whether that's to convene conversations, like-minded people, what that might be, other donors, other nonprofits together. And I think sometimes part of what the big missing piece is the convene part. And I think in some ways, because we're missing that big convene part or even that connect part, we've lost traction in the world of how do we get people to understand what's happening around media so we can put our dollars towards changing that trajectory.
Yep. Happily, I think that there's some movement on that front. I think the 2024 election was a real wake-up call for funders who now better understand just how challenging this media information landscape has become. Yeah,
I agree. For those listening, we'll end in about 5 minutes to answer questions. So if you have any, please continue to type them out. So I'll just go 2 more questions for you, then we'll turn it over to audience questions. But maybe one simple one. You kind of talked about this a little bit, but where do you see the nonprofit sector, particularly funding opportunities 5 years from now? Where are we?
Well, I think there's going to be less government money, even if we have a Democratic administration and Congress back in power, because the long-term fiscal trends are pretty bleak at both the federal, state, and local level. We live in an aging society, and the obligations to provide for the retiring boomer generation are profound and are going to squeeze a lot of spending in other areas. And I see that as just an ongoing trend. On the other hand, we have a lot of new wealth that is going to be coming in philanthropically. As I mentioned, the 800 billionaires in America currently have a combined net worth of about $7 trillion. And, 5 years from now, that's probably going to be $10 trillion, given how crazily top heavy our economy has been. But a lot of that, money is going to eventually start to flow for philanthropy. And then there's thousands of households in America with assets of, over 10 or $20 million. And then there's just a vast, untapped potential of smaller and medium donors. The top 20% of the income group in America is now the most liberal segment of the entire population. And that top 20% is sitting on trillions and trillions of dollars in wealth. Many of them are not giving at anything like the level that they could. Many have not really been asked in ways that connect with them and are effective. So I think that we're going to need new strategies to try to get at some of that locked up wealth, not just held by the people at the tippy top, but also, the people in that top 20%.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think that convener side of funders is where we need to think about who comes up with that strategy. It doesn't have to be clearly one strategy or one person or one group, but I think we should, one of the things I think funders could be doing is convening conversations to think about what that strategy is moving forward, especially ones that are already moving in that direction. I think would be really great. To be able to do some of that. Folks, we have a couple more minutes. Please make sure to drop your questions in the comment section, and we'll continue going. So I'll end with my last question I have for you. I have a few more, but this is where I'll end, I think. As an organization, Impact Justice really centers the idea of optimism. We do criminal justice work. We have to live in a space and a mindset of optimism that things can change and things will change. We've seen change happen. I will say that optimism got a real challenge in the beginning of this year, when we had federal cuts and just the state of the country. But the foundation of our role as optimists in the organization has really been what's, I think, holding us together in many ways, particularly in this complete chaos that we're all experiencing right now. But we stay grounded in hope. And so even when, we had to announce it was happening at the organization, we had to bring in these ideas of hope and what grounds us and what we're going to continue to do. So I really have a simple question for you, which is what brings you hope right now? What are you thinking about in the future that helps you keep going and keep doing the work that you're doing and keep speaking in the way that you are?
Well, I'm a keen student of American history, which is, has some really dark chapters, but it also has periods where we kind of come out of those dark chapters and push back. So I particularly have read a lot about America, in the early 1900s, at the very beginning of the progressive era, and at that point, this was really an oligarchical country where the trusts were in pretty much complete control of state governments and a lot of the national government, and there was no federal real kind of social safety net or regulatory apparatus. The Supreme Court was deeply conservative. We didn't even have the ability to have a federal income tax. Women couldn't vote. Jim Crow was still, in place. National guards were routinely deployed at the behest of corporate titans to crush labor revolts. There was widespread repression. And, we had a powerful progressive political movement that pushed past that and passed 3 constitutional amendments. and laid the groundwork later for the New Deal. And so my feeling is like, if we can get out of that period in American history, we certainly can get out of the current period that we're in. We're in much better shape than we were, say, in 1910.
Yeah. First of all, appreciate the mini history lesson that we got. I didn't say in your bio the degrees that you've gotten and your work. So I appreciate our mini history lesson on that. And I agree. You know, we all just the 4th of July just happened. We all celebrate. The 4th of July just happened. And I think for some people, they're celebrating some version of freedom. I think for other people, they were not. But I think it did allow us to think about what has changed, what change looks like. And the reason we get to even have the 4th, the reason we get to think about whether it's Juneteenth or think about anything else is because change has existed. In our criminal justice work that we're thinking about prisons and jails, so often we think about what should be done. You know, they do the Norway model and the Finland model, and everyone's like, this is what we could be doing. And so much of our work has to really hold the foundation of, well, this is what has happened. And if we keep doing what we're doing here, at least we know we'll move the needle, but how do we force people to think about what can really happen with some dollars that come in? So I love that your optimism and your hope around that is, if we were able to make it out of that, I know we can make it out of this. I can't say we'll be unscathed, but we'll make it out of this in that way. So I appreciate that. I'm going to switch to some questions that we have. So we have a couple of minutes for questions. Are you good with that, David? Okay, great. So one question we have, which is, we think a lot about creative partnerships here. This is the person that's asking this question. We think a lot about creative partnerships here. And I've also mentioned the role of funders in convening the right groups. Who do you think most needs to be at the table together right now? And how can nonprofits help facilitate that?
Well, I guess it depends what table you're talking about. In my recent writing, I've talked a lot about the need to really prioritize investing in groups that work at the state and local level. I mean, ultimately, the pressure on politicians and the pushback to what's happening has to be exerted by communities on their elected representatives. And I think philanthropy has a very ambivalent relationship with organizing. Philanthropists would often rather invest in litigation, kind of elite level advocacy strategies, think tanks, media work, all of which is important for sure. But ultimately, we need a much bigger investment in organizing groups which work at the community level. And I think that funders need to get past some of their discomfort with those organizations. I mean, I write a lot about how the philanthropic world is very much in an elite world, right? And I think there's sort of some gut level discomfort with investing in movements led by working class people and that focus on the front line level. And philanthropy really needs to get past that and bring more of those people to the kinds of tables that we're talking about.
Yeah, I appreciate that answer. I think one of the things that we often think about in that same realm is how do we, I think so oftentimes we're thinking about the convening as nonprofits. Our impacted communities are the primary people that we go to bring about conversations. And I think nonprofits and foundations are often missing what that impacted population means, fill in the blank impacted, and not just the nonprofits, but also the people with the experiences to say what we should be doing. I think you also run into that conversation that you talked about earlier, which is how do we hold both the focus of what needs to happen and what people care about, like the economy and changing that, and also hold these culture issues at the exact same time in those convenings. And I think sometimes that's difficult to do, but I think important. And I think the more you talk about it, the more you verbalize it, the better we can get at having those tough conversations and being able to strategize in a way, knowing that something is going to get lost, but think about what that might be. One more question. A couple more. What role do you feel focuses on viable outcomes plays or should play in determining which organizations and programs get funded in tighter funding circles? Verifiable, actually. What role do you feel focusing on verifiable outcomes plays, or what should they play in determining which organizations programs get funded in tight funding circles?
It really depends upon what area you're talking about. I mean, I think that there are some areas of nonprofit work which are just much more amenable to hard metrics of evaluation. And if you're, as a funder, interested in one of those spaces, it's completely legitimate to be asking, like, let's see the evidence of the impact of your work in terms of, whatever it is, whatever goals you're trying to pursue. On the other hand, there's a lot of things that nonprofits do that don't really lend themselves to hard and fast metrics, and particularly when it comes to building long-term power, political power for historically marginalized communities, or pushing an advocacy or policy agenda. I mean, this stuff is to measure it, and so I would say there, those kind of verifiable outcomes should be of less priority to donors.
Yeah. I love that you said that. Say it louder. So one more time. Say it louder for the funder in the back to hear some of that. We have one more. I think we have another question. What do you take from the election of the Democratic candidate for mayor in New York, who ran on the issue of affordability and the response to his campaign by donors?
Yeah, well, I think it really underscores how these issues of affordability are front and center for voters, and that when you talk about them, people are responsive, right? This is particularly in a big city like New York or Los Angeles, where I live, like the housing crunch, the cost of healthcare, food. I mean, these things are just overwhelmingly on people's minds. Childcare. And I think that the lesson here is talk about them often, talk about them a lot. In terms of the response by donors, I think people are afraid of how this guy is going to be kind of caricatured by this vast right-wing media ecosystem I was talking about earlier. I mean, pretty much everything that progressive movement does, you just have to keep in mind, how is this gonna kind of ricochet through, this media world that reaches tens of millions of people and can really shift the narrative, right? And so I think that's a legitimate concern here. And while I think issues of affordability and talking about the economy is generally a winner for Democrats and progressives, these issues are also complicated. I mean, I think that there are the value of self-reliance in America as a deep-seated American political value, and the value of economic freedom. Like, these are very strong, and there's ways in which sort of democratic socialist rhetoric and policy ideas telegraph something for nothing or being anti-business. And I think that is very dangerous terrain for the left.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you for that. All right, I think we're going to wrap up here. It has been such a pleasure talking with you, David, today. Do you have any last comments? You want a mic drop moment? Anything you want to add before we wrap completely up?
Nope, just to say thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you, everyone who's listening today. We're super excited to continue this conversation. So bye, everyone. Thanks so much.